After the ruins of the Second World War settled into silence, the world did not return to normal because normal no longer existed. Instead, humanity stepped into an entirely new structure of power, one where empires were no longer ruled by crowns and colonies, but by systems, institutions, alliances, technology, and invisible networks that reached across borders without ever planting a flag. And this transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded quietly, deliberately, and often unnoticed by the people living inside it, because unlike past ages of conquest, the New World Order was not built through open invasion, but through influence, deterrence, economics, ideology, and fear. The old imperial powers of Europe emerged from the war exhausted, their cities damaged, their economies broken, and their authority weakened beyond repair, while two nations that had escaped devastation, the United States and the Soviet Union, rose to fill the vacuum, not as traditional empires, but as ideological giants representing competing visions of how the world should function. And from that moment onward, global power stopped being about land alone and became about control of systems, financial, military, political, and psychological. The Cold War that followed was not merely a standoff between armies, but a restructuring of global order itself, where influence mattered more than occupation, and where power could be projected without firing a single shot, through alliances like NATO and the Warsaw Pact, through economic frameworks, intelligence agencies, propaganda, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation that made direct war unthinkable yet ever present. As nuclear weapons locked the superpowers into mutual restraint, the battlefield shifted elsewhere, to proxy wars in distant countries, to coups, sanctions, aid programs, and economic pressure, turning entire regions into testing grounds for influence rather than conquest. And in doing so, the world learned a brutal lesson, that peace on paper could still mean suffering in practice, because while great powers avoided direct conflict, smaller nations often paid the price. At the same time, global institutions were created not out of pure idealism, but out of necessity, as the United Nations, World Bank, IMF, and other bodies emerged to manage conflict, rebuild economies, and prevent another total war. Yet these institutions also became instruments of influence, shaping policy, development, and power dynamics in ways that favored those who controlled their rules, ensuring that authority no longer came from imperial decree, but from participation in systems that defined legitimacy itself. Money, once a tool of empires, became a weapon in its own right, as global finance networks, currencies, and trade agreements replaced colonial extraction, allowing nations and corporations alike to exert control without soldiers. And as markets grew interconnected, economic stability became inseparable from political power, meaning that crashes, sanctions, and debt could cripple countries as effectively as invasion once had. Meanwhile, corporations expanded beyond borders, evolving into entities with revenues larger than nations, influencing labor, technology, media, and even foreign policy, creating a world where power was no longer centralized in governments alone, but dispersed across private interests that operated above traditional accountability, further blurring the line between state authority and economic dominance. Technology accelerated this transformation at an unprecedented pace, turning information into power and surveillance into control. As satellites watched borders from space, computers processed data at unimaginable speeds, and communication networks erased distance entirely, making the world smaller, faster, and more interconnected, but also more vulnerable, because control of information meant control of perception, and perception increasingly shaped reality. Media became a battlefield where narratives replaced armies, where public opinion could be guided, fractured, or manipulated, and where wars could be justified, ignored, or forgotten depending on who controlled the story, ensuring that modern power often operated not through force, but through belief. As the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of the 20th century, many believed the world had entered a unipolar moment where one superpower stood unchallenged. Yet this apparent victory masked a deeper shift because the systems built during the Cold War did not disappear. They expanded, globalized, and adapted, creating a world where power no longer required dominance by a single empire, but coordination across military alliances, financial systems, technological platforms, and cultural influence. New powers emerged, not always through military might, but through economic growth, strategic positioning, and technological leverage, turning the global order into a complex multipolar web where influence flowed in multiple directions at once, making conflict harder to define and harder to contain. In this new era, war itself changed form, becoming less about armies crossing borders and more about cyber attacks, economic pressure, political destabilization, and proxy conflicts that maintained plausible deniability, ensuring that the world could exist in a state of permanent tension without ever declaring full-scale war. Ordinary people lived under the illusion of peace, going about daily life unaware of how deeply global systems shaped their security, economies, and freedoms, while decisions made in distant boardrooms, summits, and data centers influenced everything from employment to information to national stability. Fear did not vanish with the end of world wars. It evolved, becoming quieter and more constant, embedded in warnings, alerts, economic uncertainty, and the awareness that the systems sustaining modern life were fragile, interconnected, and capable of collapse under pressure. The New World Order promised stability through balance, yet that balance relied on continuous management, competition, and control, ensuring that peace was no longer the absence of conflict, but the careful avoidance of catastrophe. No empire ruled the world outright, yet the world was not free from dominance because power had become systemic rather than territorial, exercised through rules rather than rulers, through networks rather than nations, and through influence rather than invasion. The irony of this order is that it was built to prevent total war, yet it inherited the same fundamental flaw as every system before it. It depends on human ambition, fear, and belief. And as history has shown repeatedly, systems are only as stable as the people who control them, and only as durable as the trust placed in them. The post-war world was not the end of history, but its transformation, a shift from visible empires to invisible structures, from conquest to control, and from open conflict to permanent tension. And as humanity moved deeper into this era, one truth became impossible to ignore, that the age of empires had ended, but the struggle for power had not. It had simply learned to hide itself better, shaping the modern world not through marching armies, but through systems that never sleep, networks that never stop, and an order that defines reality itself, leaving the future uncertain, fragile, and forever shaped by the decisions made in the shadow of the wars that came before.